Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite films, Rocky, its sequels, its legacy, and the upcoming film Creed 2. Let's get started. Now, Rocky may seem dated to most people today, and I would bet that if it was released in today's climate, it would not have been as successful as it was back in 1976. It probably would not have won the Oscar either, but it still retains some of its power. So let's examine it. The 1970s was a time of cynicism. The U.S. was going through the trauma of having fought a long, drawn-out, unpopular war in Vietnam and lost. This was followed by the biggest political scandal the United States had in all its history, Watergate, where cabinet members actually went to jail, and it was the first resignation of a U.S. president. A decade earlier, we saw the assassination of John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. This was a hippie era, civil rights movement, Black Panthers, women's liberation, the generation gap. Culture had changed, and so had film. You can still see some of the family-oriented, wholesome films on TV, but in the movies, we had the anti-hero, disenchanted youth, gangsters and con men. Granted, some of the best films were made in that era. The Godfather films, The French Connection, Midnight Cowboy, In the Heat of the Night, Bonnie and Clyde, The Sting, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Films had messages back then. They were heavy. They were pretentious. There was 2001, A Space Odyssey. Now, here and there, we had an occasional musical like Oliver and The Sound of Music, but think about that. Oliver was about orphanages and child abuse and poverty, and The Sound of Music dealt with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Then in 1975, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest won the Oscar, where the heroes were either misfits or insane, and the system had to break it down. But then came 1976, and people were hungry for some light, fluffy piece of hope. It was a year that Jimmy Carter proved that a peanut farmer could become the president. It was also the year of the bicentennial. The United States was ready to celebrate its 200th birthday, and in that year, along came Rocky. Sylvester Stallone was an unknown actor, even though he had been doing films for 10 years. He was compelling in the film The Lords of Flatbush, and he wrote the screenplay to Rocky in 10 days. Now, he went over to producers Robert Chartoff and Irwin Winkler, and they took it up on him. They decided that they would make the film. However, they wanted somebody else to play Rocky. Robert Redford, Ryan O'Neal, Burt Reynolds, James Caan, and Sylvester Stallone, despite not having a lot of money, and his wife was pregnant at the time, said no. He refused to sell the screenplay unless he played Rocky. So he was hired. But because of his stubbornness, the entire production of the film could only cost about $1 million. So a cast was put together, and a director was chosen, John G. Avildsen. Now, John G. Avildsen, I believe, is the unsung hero of all these Rocky films. Avildsen had a sense of what he wanted to see, a good-hearted protagonist. Now, Stallone's original screenplay had Rocky playing a street thug boxer who did drugs and got a chance to fight the heavyweight champion who was an undefeated but aging Apollo Creed. The trainer Mickey was a racist who used the N-word, and when Rocky fights Apollo, he's close to winning, and Mickey's there screaming racist things, and Rocky decides to throw the fight, refuses to beat Apollo, loses on purpose, and walks away from the fight game. That was the original plot. But director Avildsen would have none of it. He told Stallone to rewrite the whole thing. So, in the story, there were no drugs, less thuggery, no racism. Apollo is not over the hill, more heart, less story. This is a time of epics where everybody wanted to make a big film, but John G. Avildsen believed that if you speed up the story, you lose the character. And if you slow down the events and take your time, the audience gets to know the characters very well without being told too much. Rocky is an uneducated high school dropout, not bright, disillusioned, lonely, hitting 30, a victim of bullying at school, a not very loving father with nowhere to go but up. He's in love with a pet store clerk named Adrian, equally disillusioned, chronically shy, lonely with low self-esteem, bullied as well, living with her brother Paulie, the butcher. Fat, drunk, angry at life, probably bipolar, life passing him by, taking out all his frustrations on the people around him. Then there's Mickey the trainer in his mid-70s, still training fighters, living poor, a former boxer who never made it, with no patience with boxers like Rocky, who wasted their talents and potential. All four of these characters were beaten up by life, but they're still moving forward because, hey, you gotta eat. And then here comes Apollo Creed, a charismatic, proud, full of life character who likes to clown around, but make no mistake, he's a great fighter and he knows it. And everybody loves Apollo, especially Apollo. And he chooses Rocky as a replacement to fight him during the winter holidays. He promotes the fight and he looks at Rocky as easy pickings, but for Rocky, it's the fight of his life, his one and only chance to prove himself. So, director Avildsen affected the film tremendously, and there was also Bill Conti with his musical score, exhilarating and exciting. And if you were around in the 70s, you didn't know how this movie was going to end. You would not be surprised if Rocky got knocked out in the first round and you could go home saying, well, you can't beat the system, etc., etc. But when the movie ended on a believable yet exciting high note, the movie audience went berserk. Holy crap, did you see that? And later on, the $1 million movie made over $200 million, which equals $500 million today. And so the film Rocky, about a little boxer who could, became the little movie who could. 10 Oscar nominations kicked in. What was the competition? All the President's Men, Taxi Driver, Bound for Glory, and Network. Now, I didn't see Bound for Glory, but the other three films touched on the same Hollywood cynicism that I was talking about before. And the entire cast of characters in Rocky, all the actors were nominated. Now, the Rocky film only won 3 Oscars: Best Editor, Best Director, and it won Best Picture, the big one. It was like a fairy tale. So what do I think? Well, I think Rocky was damn good, even looking back on it with the years that I have now, not the 16-year-old moviegoer that I was back then. Did it deserve the Oscar? That's not for me to say, but let's just say that the other films may have been artistically better, but remember that art is also subjective, and there's nothing wrong with a little fluff and a little bit of excitement, a little happiness and warmth. The other films, Taxi Driver especially and Network, were bound along with the cynicism that I was talking about. Incidentally, director John G. Avildsen also directed the later films, The Karate Kid. Those were films that also invested in his characters, making us personally involved, and so the climax is much more nerve-wracking and exciting. Okay, from this point on, spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about the films and what happens. Now, director John G. Avildsen goes on to other things. Stallone becomes Hollywood's newest darling, and along comes Rocky II, which Stallone decides to write and direct. Now, the problem with a sequel is that the film is no longer yours. It somewhat belongs to the audience now. So how do you give them what they want and give them something else as well? Well, Rocky II accomplishes this by playing it safe. The characters are in a happier place. Rocky and Adrian are married. They have some money. The film has a different comedic element to it. It's not as dreary. But for the most part, it's a remake of Rocky I. So though I enjoyed the film, it's superfluous, seems unnecessary, and we wanted Rocky to win. It was nice that he did, but the film lacked the freshness of the original. But that said, the characters are engaging, and the final fight is very exciting. Then comes Rocky III. Okay, by this point, it's like going to McDonald's. You go into the theater knowing what you're going to get. This time there's some new drama. Rocky is rich, he's comfortable, but he loses his edge. Then his trainer dies, and he loses a championship. Can he get it back? Well, it's no surprise, of course, but this time Apollo Creed joins in as his new manager, and Carl Weathers expands the role, making the previous antagonist believable and likable. Stallone's body is leaner, and so is the movie. Only 90 minutes. Formulaic, but different enough to work. Even though it's more of the same. It moves along brisk, to the point, a solid hit. And then comes Rocky IV. Rocky IV was very successful, more than the other Rockies, but guess what? I hated it. Rocky IV strips away all the humanity of his characters. It goes through the motions, it's robotic. The villain is robotic. Hell, even Paulie has a robot. It's a cartoon, good versus evil. And Apollo dies, and I wish Apollo's death would have been something different, not just a plot device, nothing more. The movie, it tries to kill time, filling it with MTV-style music videos. James Brown steps in to sing an entire song, Living in America. Rocky drives his Lamborghini while the video plays scenes from all 4 films. There are 2 training montages with music, and during the fight, 2 fight montages. And the antagonist, Ivan Drago, who could punch 3 times harder than the average heavyweight, wasn't able to beat the smaller Rocky? I'm sorry, it's ridiculously unreal. I wonder if John G. Avildsen, the original Rocky director, if he had stepped in, what would have happened? He probably would have told Stallone to go back and rewrite the entire script like he did in Rocky 1. Eliminate the jingoistic political angle of us versus them, the US versus the Soviet Union, that plot. Hell, Stallone was already doing this with the Rambo films. And Ivan Drago, he might as well have been a James Bond villain. I believe a better plot would have been to humanize Drago, and the drama would be to have the world push these two street fighters together as rivals for political reasons that they don't understand. Make them people. I don't know, maybe have some people throw rocks at Drago's windows or something like that. Give him some believability, some humanity. Drago's wife, Ludmilla, she's played by Brigitte Nielsen, who, by the way, was Stallone's wife at the time. So perhaps for this reason, Drago and his wife don't share one kiss or one moment of affection. By the way, Brigitte Nielsen would make one other film with Stallone called Cobra, another giant turd of a movie. And let's move on. Well, despite my dislike of Rocky IV, it made buckets of money, and 5 years later, Stallone decides to go for Rocky V. And as if he was listening to my advice telepathically, he brought back John G. Avildsen to direct. Well, guess what? I liked Rocky V, but everybody else didn't, and I think I know why. Avildsen invests time in the characters here. Rocky loses money, he gets brain damage, he's forced to retire. He gets depressed, he's estranged from his son, he trains another boxer who betrays him, and the film ends with a street fight. There's no money here, no championship, just pride and a love of family. So what happened? I think that the older fans like me stayed away for the most part because they didn't like Rocky IV. And the younger Rocky IV fans who wanted more of the same didn't like Rocky V. Now I do give them points for trying, but here's where I think they failed. I'll start with Paulie, the character Paulie, who nobody but Rocky and Adrian like. He was instrumental in Rocky losing all his money. Now, I know Paulie's dumb and he didn't mean to do it, but Rocky should have gotten mad at him at least a bit. Now, the antagonist, Tommy Gunn, I agree that villains should be human, but they shouldn't be stupid. And Tommy Gunn seems to be somewhat of a victim here, being manipulated by greedy boxing promoters. If Tommy were a bit more of a villain, a bit more savvy, then his betrayal would have stung more. Then there's the fight. I like the idea of the street fight. No bell, no rules. But it fails as the climax of the movie because, was that it? Rocky wins the fight and walks away back to his little apartment, brain damaged, poor? This was all unsatisfactory. If the street fight had happened maybe half an hour earlier in the film, and they would have continued the film on a different thread, yes, it would have ended with no climax that we're used to, but it would have been a little different. And Rocky would have had a chance to maybe get a closer relationship with his son Sage around this point, and then maybe meet another fighter, someone else that he could train. And they could end the movie at least with the hope that he can climb back on his feet again. Would that have worked? I don't know. Maybe throw in that he gets a clean bill of health as well, but he decides to retire anyway. Anyway, I feel that part of the reason that I liked Rocky V so much is because I compare it to Rocky IV, which I hated. Now we jump forward 16 years later to the film Rocky Balboa. I don't know, I guess they were afraid to call it Rocky VI. But Stallone here, who's already 60 by this point, he decides to go another round with the character. Now, I thought this was a ridiculous idea, but there I was, a Rocky fan, on opening day, sitting in a movie theater, hoping that Stallone could pull it off. And he did. Not so much with the climactic fight. The fight was okay, but there was real drama here. The wife, Adrian, had died, and Rocky lost the anchor to his life. He was very lonely and very depressed, and he was getting back into the fight game. And the film isn't clear why, yet somehow we understand why. It's just who he is. There's a subplot with his son Robert, who turns out to be a bit of a douchebag, arrogant and resentful. And this time, Rocky yells at his son. His son is in the wrong, and Rocky gives him some life lessons. It was a small, low-budget film, and it feels that way, apparently appropriately so. And by Rocky being less of an event, we can relax and follow the character. Now, there's an interesting love interest. Rocky helps Marie, a girl who grew up in his neighborhood, but he ends up not romancing her. It's as if nobody could replace his wife, Adrian. It looks like in an act of loneliness he reached out to somebody, but he doesn't close the deal, as if realizing that it just wasn't meant to be, or maybe he's just not that ready. I like that Stallone reclaimed the character and wrapped it up in a warm-hearted small moment. An old man content with his life. And now we come to 2015's Creed. By now, Stallone becomes a supporting actor. This is the only Rocky film that was not written and not directed by him. Stallone allowed a young black filmmaker, Ryan Coogler, to take over both as director and as the writer alongside Aaron Covington. Now let me start by saying that it's a small but affecting movie. Michael B. Jordan as Adonis Creed, Apollo's illegitimate forgotten son, invests his character with swag, but enough insecurity abounds that he's overly sensitive to criticism, he's cocky, and he makes some dumb decisions. All based on his sense of being abandoned as a child, yet despite everybody around him objecting to his choices, he goes off on his own to claim or live up to a legacy. As his girlfriend, Tessa Thompson, is effective as well, the neighbor who is trying hard to make a singing career before going totally deaf. And Stallone, well, he's at his best here. Aging, world-weary, sad, but still strong, it's the performance of his career. Running a restaurant, visiting his wife's gravesite, just accepting his age and waiting for the end. But along comes Adonis Creed asking for help. Now Adonis needs a father figure, and Rocky reluctantly becomes one. Now on that note, Rocky's son Robert does not appear in the film. He's gone off to Vancouver with a girlfriend, away from Philadelphia, and sadly, away from Rocky, who is increasingly alone. On a poignant note, let me just say that Sylvester Stallone's son, real-life son, Sage, who came out in Rocky V, had passed away. And this adds to the pathos of the film. So anyway, Rocky does adopt this young fighter, in a sense, and he somehow understands him. Now, Ryan Coogler directs with an assurance that has to be beholden. There is a fight midway through the movie that was filmed in one tracking shot. Amazing. The big fight is exciting enough, conjuring up memories of the previous Rocky films. It pays homage to the other Rocky films, and it ends with Rocky and Adonis on the steps of the Philadelphia Museum overlooking the city. The aging fighter passing the torch to the young up-and-comer. Life is good. I loved it. And now in November 2018 comes Creed 2, and I am nervous. Ryan Coogler is not directing. He's off there making the Black Panther films. I don't know who the new director is. Stephen Capel. And the writer, guess what? Sylvester Stallone. And what did he come up with? Well, in this film, Creed 2, Adonis is going to fight Victor Drago, the son of Ivan Drago, who killed Apollo Creed back in Rocky IV. It sounds very cheesy to me. And guess what? Actor Dolph Lundgren and Stallone's ex-wife Brigitte Nielsen are also back as Drago and the wife Ludmilla. Oh geez, I smell potential for disaster. I really hope that Stallone writes a decent screenplay. I sure hope it works. Now listen to me as if I invested any money in this film, as if I had a stake in it. But anyway, Stallone, I hope he writes more about Adonis and less about Rocky. I hope vanity doesn't take over. I hope that the cast and crew can pull it off. Now, Stallone has done some good work, so don't get me wrong, but I still remember that he wrote and directed Staying Alive, the sequel to Saturday Night Fever. Please don't get me started. But anyway, I have hopes for Creed 2. I plan to be there. I will see it. And in the meantime, give me your thoughts. Comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.